Okay, good morning, everyone. For those who are experiencing morning right now, and good evening to those joining us from other parts of the world. We're very happy to see so many folks back for our continued journey through Genesis with Rabbi Silber. Those of you joining us on Zoom, thank you. If you feel inspired to accept the invitation to become a panelist so that you can turn your camera on and show your face and be in the room for class, so to speak. It also helps you to unmute and mute yourself on your own without so much assistance from me when we have time for questions, comments, discussion. You're also, of course, welcome to use the chat here on Zoom if that's your preference. Those joining us on Facebook Live, good morning. Glad you're here. You can put questions and comments in the comment section right below the video, and I will keep track of them and bring them over here if there are any. And to those joining us on Drisha Live, we're glad that you're learning with us. So the text for this class, of course, is the Tanakh, and you are more than welcome to use your own. For those who prefer not to be flipping pages, that's perfectly all right. I will do my best to keep us up to date with pertinent text on screen for your convenience. And without further ado, Rabbi Silber, please.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're in the middle of chapter 34, story of Dinah. And we've gotten to the point where Shem and his father Hamor go out. Initially, it says that Hamor went out to greet Yaakov. Yaakov waits for his children to return. And there's a meeting of the four parties. There's Yaakov and his children. And then there's Shem and Hamor. And Shem has said that he wants to marry Dinah. He tells them to name their price, and he will be happy to pay the bride price, dowry bride price. And then, in addition to that, though, there's an offer to, and this is important, there's an offer that in general, there should be intermarriage between the two parties, between Shem on one hand, the people of Shem and Yaakov's family. They should dwell together. In the words of the Torah, it's Teshvu ba'aretz, haaretz tifnechem shvu schavua heyochazu ba. So that offer is found in chapter 34. Itanu teshevu, you dwell with us. We can intermarry. You will give us your daughters, and you will take ours. And you can dwell together with us. Itanu teshevu. Not simply dwelling together, it's intermarrying as well. And now we have the response. Yaakov says nothing. Yaakov does not respond. It's one of the interesting questions in the chapter. But his sons speak up, and that we began in verse number 13. Vayanu b'nei Yaakov et Shem, v'yed Chamor avi mirma vayidaberu. So we pointed out two things, maybe three. Asher timei etina achotam. First of all, that vayanu, which means to respond, often means to respond. But in this particular case, it probably is a play on the very first verse of chapter 34, where it says he took her vayaneha. That's in verse number 2, actually, of chapter 34. Vayaneha, he abused her, often sexual abuse is inui. So that is perhaps related to that. And then we're told they spoke b'mirma, in this deception or guile. That's certainly a negative term. It's what Yitzchak has said about Yaakov, your brother, you told Esav, your brother came b'mirma, in guile, and took your blessing. And then the Torah gives the reason that they speak this way. Asher timei et Dinah chotam, he had defiled their sister Dinah. In fact, that term timei appears earlier in the story as well, when Yaakov first hears. We're told that Yaakov heard, Yaakov shema ki timei et Dinah bito, in verse number 5. Tamei, defile, make impure, etc. Obviously a negative term throughout the Bible. So they're speaking from that perspective. The Torah tells us their perspective, that he's defiled their sister, and they're speaking in guile, deceptively. They have a plan in mind. Now over here, it's interesting to note, take note of this, that in verse number 13, it says that the sons of Jacob spoke b'mirma. It doesn't single out particular sons, because later in the chapter, the Torah will single out specifically two of the sons of Yaakov, Shimon and Levi. But over here, the speaking with guile is Bnei Yaakov, all of Jacob's sons. It's not just two, it's all of them. And they have the following, they say the following. They say, they said to them, that is to Shem and Hamor, we can't do this. We can't give our sister to an uncircumcised man. This is a cherepah, a disgrace for us. So we can't do this. The condition, though, in the next verse, in verse 15, we agree under this condition. Imtiu kamonu limolachem kol zachar. V'natanu epinotenu lachem v'epinotechem likachanu. V'yashavnu itchem v'yinu li'am echad. So it's interesting to note, they say under these, we can't do it, under these conditions, it's not possible. But if you circumcise the men, then we can give you our daughters and take yours. We will dwell with you. And then they add three words, which Shem and Hamor did not say. The brothers say this. V'yinu li'am echad will become one nation. That seems to go beyond what was offered earlier. Earlier was, you live together with us. Yes, we'll be on good terms. Yes, there may be marriages back and forth. But the statement, we become one nation, that wasn't mentioned by either Shem or Hamor. It's the brothers who say such a thing. And one can only wonder here whether it is, that's not a possibility. You can't, in the book of Bereshit, become one nation with these people. For starters, they are Chivi, they are Canaanites. It's not in the cards, basically. So the question is, we know they're speaking b'mirma, but the question that hovers over the story, of course, is always, well, there are two questions. What is the Torah's point of view? What is the narrator's point of view? That's a critical question that we'll deal with. We started already. And the other question is, what is Yaakov actually thinking here? Yaakov is silent. It's not possible that Yaakov would agree, as the Ramban notes, to become one nation with these people. Presumably, to merge them as one nation is hard to believe. We'll get back to that later on. That's what they say. So they seem to say, under present circumstances, we can't agree, but under these conditions, we would agree. However, they continue, if you don't listen to us, that is to accept in verse number 17, we'll take our daughter and we will leave. You have to scroll down. We'll take our daughter and leave. That's it. That's what it sounds like from their speech, that they feel that if they say we don't accept it, that Shem and Hamor will say, okay, sorry to hear that. Here's your daughter Dinah, and you can leave. That's what it sounds like. We'll take our daughter and go. So this is what the conversation is about. And now let's continue with our story. We'll get back to these core questions throughout our session today. So the words they're offered pleases Hamor and Shem. The nod that is Shem did not hesitate, for he wanted, one might say even infatuated with Jacob's daughter. And he was the most respected one in his father's house. So perhaps what he's doing is setting an example for everybody else. So he's more than happy to give in to this request because he's in love, as we've seen, with Dinah, Yaakov's daughter. Now let's see what happens next. Scroll down. Now the question is, Hamor and Shem have to convince the people of Shem, the town Shem, because that was the condition. We can't become one nation with you if the male men are not circumcised. So Hamor and Shechem set out to convince the townspeople to circumcise themselves. And in order to do that, they have to convince them that it's in their interest to do so. So now we see what they say, and we'll raise a question about this. These people, and now the Torah shows a very interesting word, ashlemim. The translator says our friends. The word shlemim doesn't literally mean friends. They are whole with us. It sounds like they're being honest with us, or they are forthright with us. Literally means complete. But the word shlemim is one of those words that's a marker in the text, because we saw it earlier at the end of chapter 33, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem. And above all, we have the covenantal promise back in chapter 15. Da Rivi'i Yashuvu Hena Ki Lo Shalem Avona and Moriad Hena. God said to Abraham in chapter 15, the fourth generation shall return to the land. You have to wait till the fourth generation, for the sin of the Amori until that point will not be shalem. It is, and that's actually a very important point that's easy to miss. It's very easy to miss. And that is, if you count out the generations, this is a very important point for understanding of this chapter. If you count out the generations, God speaks to Abraham in chapter 15, the covenantal promise. The fourth generation shall return to the land. 3 generations of suffering. And the plain meaning of the text, I think, if you count out the generations, God speaks to Abraham. He's the first generation. Yitzchak is generation number 2. Yaakov is generation number 3. And V'dar Revi'i, and the fourth generation shall return to the land. So the fourth generation should be Yaakov's children. And if we understand return to the land, meaning possess the land, then the story of Shechem, this chapter, is about the actual possession of the land. Yaakov, we have seen, I have argued, is both third and fourth generation. He becomes Israel. But certainly the fourth generation are Yaakov's sons, Yaakov's children. It's the fourth generation. So the story over here then, this conquest of Shechem, is in effect a fulfillment of the covenantal promise, which raises all kinds of interesting questions about this event, about their behavior, etc. But it has to be understood within that framework. So now Shechem and Hamor is speaking to the people of the town. They will stay in the land, they'll settle here, they'll move about in it. Yischaru could be to move about. Schor means to go around, but Yischaru or Socher is one who sells things. So maybe because people that sell typically would move from place to place to sell their goods. In any event, V'yeshvu ba'aretz v'yischaru ota sounds like they'll be with us, and this is a good business opportunity for us. V'ya'aretz hinei rachavat yodayim lifneihem. For the land is large enough for them. That is to say, and don't worry, they'll take our real estate. There's plenty of room for both of us. Et benotam nikach lanu l'nashim. We will take their daughters. V'et benotenu nitein lahem, and we'll give them our daughters. So when they speak to the people of Shechem, they reversed what they said earlier. Earlier they said to Yaakov and Yaakov's sons, you will take our daughters and give us your daughters. And when he speaks to the people of Shechem, he says, we will take their daughters and we'll give them our daughters. Playing on latet v'lokachat. Of course, one could make the argument that he's trying to convince them. So he's selling this deal to them in a way that makes it more attractive to them, which raises the question, what are they really thinking over here? What is it, just trying to convince them by representing it a certain way? Or in effect, is this, are they saying in effect we can co-opt them? We can integrate them into our society. We'll take advantage of them. We'll use them for our purposes. It's a win for us. And fine, let them stay with us, but we'll be able to take whatever we want and give them whatever we want. That's verse 21. Let's keep going. However, there's one condition. The people who always come to us, here he mentions the language of Yaakov's children, Am Echad, which they had mentioned that. Only if we circumcise the males as they are circumcised. And then he adds, their cattle, their substance, their possessions, they will be ours. However, we have to agree, and if we do agree, so clearly, the representation of Hamor and Shechem to the town of Shechem. Shechem is the person, and Shechem is the town. And here it's very clear from verse number 23, what they are saying is that yes, that will be one nation on one hand. On the other hand, it's all to our benefit because all of their possessions will become ours. So here he presents it to them as the opportunity to essentially, more than integrate them into our society, integrate and take advantage of them. And again, the question here, there are a couple of different questions. Do they really mean it? That's one question. Or they're just trying to convince them. On the other hand, what the town of Shechem is hearing is certainly, this is an opportunity for us to take, right? Take from them, right? Nikach, to take. And this, of course, raises the questions, if in fact, this is what it's about, the attempt of the town of Shechem to essentially take over Jacob and Jacob's family, then it would certainly present the behavior of Shimon and Levi and the brothers in killing the whole town of Shechem in a different light. It's more of the fact they molested and kidnapped their sister. And now they want to actually co-opt the whole family. That's one way to read it. And then we would be, I say, more sympathetic to Shimon and Levi. But this is the question, and it's very not clear. You can't, I think, tell whether it's more about just misrepresentation or whether it is really the plan. But from the standpoint of the people that are hearing it, I would say, the people of Shechem, what do they know? What they're hearing is this is what it is. We circumcise the men, and we were able to take the women, and we're able to take their possessions as well. That's verse number 23. Let's just read a few more verses, then I'll stop and take some comments. So the townspeople, Vayishmu doesn't mean to hear, it means to accept. They accepted, Lishmo often means to accept. All Yotzei Sharimo, all those that fellow townspeople. Vayimo Kol Zachar Kol Yotzei Sharimo, they did this. Vahi Bayom HaShlishi, but on the third day, Biotam Koavim, Vayichu Shnei Bnei Yaakov, Shimon v'Levi, Achei Dinah Ish Chabo. Two of them, Shimon and Levi, whom the Torah describes as Dinah's brothers, took their sword. Vayavo Ha'ir Betach. They came upon the city Betach. The city was secure, that is, they can't fight back because all the men are in pain. Vayagu Kol Zachar. They killed all the men. And let's keep one more verse, verse number 26. V'yed Chamar v'yed Shechem b'no haglu lefi charev. Vayichu et Dinah mi beit Shechem vayetzeim. They killed Chamar, they killed Shechem with the sword. They took Dinah out of the house of Shechem and they left. Okay, we'll get to the continuation of the story, but the obvious question here is, what does the Torah think of all this? What is, what might say, the narrator? What is the Torah's thought about this about the story, about the behavior, about the various characters? Before we delve into that, which is one of the critical questions, if anybody has a comment or question now, please speak up.
Yes? If it's L'Shem Hashem, to kovesh the land, is one thing. but the real issue here is revenge on the daughter. And you don't see the L'Shem Hashem aspect of this kibush.
No, I didn't. No, right. I mean, I'm not saying that even that these sons of Yaakov are thinking even in these terms. What I am saying is that the Torah has, in fact, spoken of the fourth generation returning to the land, which I think means possessing the land. So yes, I mean, I think that's something that has to be factored in terms of what the Torah thinks of this. I'm not saying that they're doing this in order to fulfill the covenantal promise, because it's not even clear to me that they're aware of the covenantal promise. Yaakov probably may well be, but certainly his sons may not be. But I'm saying that's another thing to factor into the story in terms of what does the Torah think. And it's actually very interesting. And even if it is a fulfillment that you will possess the land, literally return to the land, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Torah advocates for this particular behavior. After Yaakov also returned to Shechem, but Yaakov purchases the land. Those are the verses just before the story of Dinah. He comes Shalem and he buys it from the children of Hamor. The two different ways in which Jacob or Jacob's family has staking a claim to the land. One is through purchase and one is through battle. Is anybody else, or several people who want to speak up, please do.
Yeah, the idiom pi cherev. Do you have any? Do you know what that connotes? It's all over Tanakh, of course. Sometimes that is used in the description of the use of a sword, specifically fi cherev.
Sure. The sword in biblical Hebrew, the sword eats and drinks. That is true. Chabito chal basar, right? So that's the idiom of it. But beyond that, I have nothing to say about it. But that is certainly, of course, the cherev in the book of Breshit reminds us obviously of Esau. That was Esau's blessing. He lived by the sword. Achar b'cha tichyeh. So the taking of the sword, the cherev, may have a negative connotation, I think. In other words, especially if you think of it in terms of covenantal fulfillment, the covenantal fulfillment using the tools of Esau might be seen as problematic, especially given the proximity to the story of Yaakov, who simply buys the land, doesn't take it by force. But it's a good question in general.
Oh, I think I just got part of it, which in this context, it's saying that actually the sword did their talking, the continuation of their talking to those who talked to them.
Not bad. Could be something there. That could be so. Because in point of fact, their talking isn't really talking. Their talking is misleading. In general, I would say that's an interesting point. When the brothers speak, the Torah tells us it's B'mirma. They're saying words, but those words aren't actually, that's the words that they're saying are just a way to mislead the other people, and the words are a way to set up the possibility of using the sword. That's their words. Then we have the question of when Hamor speaks to the people of the town, what do his words mean? That's one of the problems. Then we have the other problem of Jacob says no words. He's silent altogether. So in this chapter in general, it's part of the problem. People speak and don't necessarily, we can't get a handle, the truth value on what they're saying. And someone that we expect to speak says nothing. And we'll get back to this. That's a good point. Anybody else for a comment or question? Yes. Yes, Tova.
So there's a problem when they say Shimon and Levi went in and killed Shem. I can understand that, but when they say Shimon and Levi, just the brothers went in and killed all the adult males, and we don't hear anything about them, getting forces among Yaakov's people. How could two people just come in and kill all the males?
That's a good question in general. I mean, that's a question in general, asking about from a sort of a realistic standpoint. How realistic could it be that two people could kill a whole town? Of course, number one, we don't know the size of the town. And number two, your question is in place. I mean, I think we can ask a similar question about other stories in Breshit. The story I'm thinking of is where Abraham, who's at least 75 at the time, probably closer to 90, takes his group of disciples, pupils, servants, and chases north of Damascus to defeat the four most powerful kings in the world. One can ask a question about that with a lightning strike, etc. So I think sometimes we have to say that the question of the realistic, of course, Malcolm Tzedek says because God has helped you, God can do anything. But in point of fact, it's a question from a realistic standpoint is in place. I'm not sure it's a question the Torah wants us to ask, though. I think the point of it is that, and let me say an additional point, which is, and this speaks to the question of their behavior altogether. There is something about their behavior, apart from what you mentioned. You mentioned the realistic problem, but the idea of killing the entire town is obviously a problem. But there's something else about the way they do it, which is, there are two problems with the way they do it, which is why my own view is the Torah isn't on anybody's side over here. The Torah condemns everybody in the story. The Torah is critical of everybody in the story. And there are two things problematic about what Shimon and Levi do. First of all, they're using circumcision to kill people. Circumcision in the Chumash is described in chapter 17 in no uncertain terms as a covenant between God and the people that have entered into God's service. So the idea that to use that as a guise to kill people is, I believe, from the Torah's perspective, problematic. That's one thing. And the second thing that I believe is problematic, I believe it to be the case based on a different text, which I think is connected, which is the idea of killing people who can't fight back is, from the Torah's perspective, I would say the Bible's perspective, problematic. It's one thing, the Torah is not a pacifistic, the Bible is not pacifistic. Yes, we prefer peace. Sometimes there's no choice. But in point of fact, the idea of attacking people who are absolutely incapable of fighting you, taking advantage of their infirmities, is something that in general, the Bible is opposed to. And I'll give you a story where this comes up actually later not in the Torah, but in the Tanakh. And that is where clearly the narrator is highly critical. And that's a story which is found in the book of Shoftim. Let me find that chapter. I believe it's chapter, let's find Shoftim. I believe it's chapter 20, chapter 17, chapter 18. That's the story, chapter 18. That's the story where, story of Pesel Micha. Pesel Micha, story of the tribe of Dan. So there's a man named Micha, he sets up a house of idolatry, whatever it is. And the tribe of Dan is unhappy with their portion that they've been given. The land is apportioned by a goral, by a lottery, by a lot. And they don't like the portion they're given, which is in central Israel. They don't want that. So they send a bunch of scouts to scout out land up north. And we're told they see a people up north who are living in relative security. The Torah describes a place called Laish, Am Shoket Uboteach, people that live in tranquility, and unsuspecting people. These are not Jewish people. And they're far away from any main center. And when the scouts come up, and the scouts also steal, as it were, will steal the priest of Micha. They steal his priest, and if they go up north, they set up shop. So there's a combination of one end, idolatry, trophim, etc. And when they get, the scouts go up north, and they see these people who are very, let me see how the Torah described it. Describes it in chapter 18 of Judges. It says the following, in verse number 7. It says, "Vayiru et ha'am asher b'kirba, yoshevet levetach." Uses the same word, betach. They dwell in betach. There is no security. Ki mishpat sidonim shoket uboteach. In machlim davar ba'aretz, yoresh etzer, urechokim hema mitzidonim, udavar ein lahem imadam. That's what they see. A people, here they translate a tranquil and unsuspecting people. No one in the land to molest them, with no ruler, distant from the Sidonim. They have no dealings with anybody. They dwell in solitude. They don't bother anybody. Nobody bothers them. Twice the book of Shoftim uses the word betach or boteach. And the scouts come back and say, these are easy pickings. Let's go and take it over. No one's going to help them. They have no allies. And again in verse number 10, am boteach. And that word boteach or betach, which appears 3 times, and clearly that chapter is clearly highly critical of the tribe of Dan, because apart from simply attacking an unsuspecting people who did them no harm, it's also a chapter all about idolatry. It's also a chapter about leaving the place that God assigned you to be and going elsewhere. Here we have a similar expression that Shimon and Levi, we are told in chapter 34, that they took their swords, vayavo ala ir betach, and they came to the city secure. Nobody can fight. So I believe that actually attacking someone who can't fight you, in the case of Shevet Dan, unsuspecting people, they don't bother anybody, nobody bothers them. So I think that's problematic. And I think using circumcision to kill is also problematic. Also speaking b'mirma is problematic. So there is no way, and actually it gets even worse, but there is no way that one can legitimately make the argument that the Torah has taken the side of Shimon and Levi. And that was Sternberg's point, and to me, it's completely off, totally. That's not to say that the Torah simply accepts Shechem and Chamor. I don't think that's true either. Shechem and Chamor, or the Torah thinks you can actually become one people. Because in point of fact, and this is a point that Sternberg makes, and I think is correct, it's not an accident that the person in the story is named Shechem and the town is named Shechem. And in point of fact, when Chamor and the person Shechem go to the town and say, listen, this is an opportunity to take them over, to co-opt them, and they listen because they feel this is a good opportunity. We'll take their women, all their women, we'll give them what we want, we'll take what we want, we'll take their possessions, we'll take their cattle. That in some sense, it makes them, to some extent, a kind of accomplice after the fact. That was Sternberg's argument, and that the Torah makes this point by making the point that the town and the person have exactly the same name, Shechem. And actually, Sternberg, I think in a different article, makes another good point, which is the following, about a different story. I just cite that over here. And that is, we all know the story when Moshe grows up. He goes out to his brethren, it says, and he sees Bayar Ish Mitzri Makeh Ish Ivri Me'achav. He sees an Egyptian hitting Ish Ivri, a Hebrew, Me'achav, one of his brethren. And the Torah says, Vayifen Kol V'cho Vayar Ki Einish. Moshe looks this way and that way. And it's chapter 2 of Shemot, of course. He sees there's nobody there. Nobody will see what he does, or maybe he sees nobody is going to do anything about it. Vayachet HaMitzri. He hit the Egyptian. Vayit Mineu B'cho. He buried him in the sand. And what Sternberg pointed out, I think it's a good observation, is that the Torah uses the same verb for both for what he sees and what he does. Even though when you think about it, it's not necessarily the same thing. Because the Egyptian is not necessarily killing the Jew. He hasn't killed him yet. He's beating him. He's the master and he beats the slave. The Torah uses the word makeh. And then Moshe is vayach. He's makeh, the one who did it. But in the case of Moshe, he actually kills him. So one could raise the question, is this right? We think of justice as quid pro quo, as midah keneged midah. You give what you get what you give. But in the case of Moshe, they're not equivalent. In one case, someone is hitting somebody. In the other case, someone is killing somebody. And Sternberg's point is that the Torah goes out of its way to draw a parallel between the two by using the same word, by using the word vayach, because the Torah could have said vayarog et hamitzri, and Moshe killed the Egyptian. He saw what's happening, vayarog et hamitzri. That would be the normal word to use. The fact that the Torah used vayach, which lends itself both to killing, makeh ish vamet, mot yumat. If one is makeh, a fellow person, and that person dies, then you put the killer to death. It says makeh ish vamet, because it's possible to be makeh and not to kill. Makeh means to hit. So the Torah, by using parallel the same word, as opposed to the more appropriate word, the Torah is saying in effect to us, the reader, think of it as this mitzvah deserves what he got. We're not going to condemn Moshe necessarily for doing what he did. That raises a host of interesting problems, but the point that the use of the language is specific and actually points us in certain directions is a good point. So I just want to clarify, I'm not claiming that the Torah says that Shimon and Levi are the bad guys and that Shechem and Hamor and the town are the good guys. I'm not claiming that at all. What it is that there's blame to go around on all sides. Nobody is free from criticism, including Shimon and Levi. So these are three reasons why. Someone else had a comment or question?
Yeah,
Yes.
Rabbi Silber, thank you so much. I learn constantly from you. I had two questions. Feel free to address or ignore either or both. What difference, I'll just say them both and we'll go from there. What difference does it make when you mentioned earlier on, notice the reversal, students, that one says we're going to take and give the daughters and the other is the giving and taking of the daughters. What practical difference does that make? And then I just didn't understand also when, so that's the first question. I didn't understand also that the understanding is that they're going to share each other's out of this love match, just like, you know, in the royal kings and queens of Europe and all that, how they marry each other for their property and power, how they're going to share the produce and the cattle. But suddenly, when Shechem and Hamor are going to explain to their people to go through with this match, they say all their cattle and substance and all their beasts will be ours. But that's not really true, right? They're going to share. Just can you elaborate on
my point is, I don't think we can tell what's really true. I think that you're talking about, these are two salesmen over here.
Okay, so it's a sell job.
And so the question is, when you have people that are always talking to the intended buyer, okay, and they present the deal a certain way, I think we've all seen that in our lives, I can imagine. That,
okay, so they're trying to
right, and
just manipulate them into saying yes.
What actually is the deal? But I don't think you can tell. You know, we've all had situations where very often, you know, when last time that we moved, they send someone to come to your apartment, very lovely person, you know what I mean? Very, very considerate, or we do this, and then they send the movers later. Right. And you say to yourself, are these the same people? Is this the same company? You know, so we've had that experience, I think. But my point is that I think the Chumash is going out of its way here to, I don't want to use the word neutral. It's not neutral so much, but to sort of step back from the story and say, we have a story here, which is on one hand about a symbolic possession of the land. Mm-hmm. And it raises a host of questions about the story, which is, it raises questions about everybody in this story is questioned. Yeah. That is, let's start with Dinah. In the story about Dinah, we know absolutely nothing about Dinah because Dinah doesn't say one word in the story. Mm. And I'll show you another story that's parallel where the Dinah character does speak actually and does act. In this story, so we don't know, which says maybe okay, she didn't like what happened, but now she's reconciled to it. The guy loves her. Maybe she's perfectly happy to stay in Shechem. I mean, how can you tell? I don't think you can tell. And then we have Shechem. The act is certainly condemned by the Torah, unequivocally condemned. Then the Torah goes out of its way to paint him as a loving person. That's interesting, actually. I'm not saying that it doesn't undo necessarily what he did. On the other hand, the Torah did go out of its way to present him with some positive words about his, and it sounds sincere. He actually loves Dinah, whatever that means. In contrast to another story where the Shem character has no redeeming qualities. Then we have Hamor and the people of Shem, what they're hearing, right? And then we have, as we mentioned, Yaakov's children, and then of course there's Yaakov, whose silence is deafening. What is he thinking? When his children say, we become one people, how could Yaakov ever agree to such a thing? That would be completely counter to this whole book. Can't be. So these are the questions. Let's continue a little bit more now. Yes.
I have a question about the equality in size of these two units.
Can you speak a bit louder, Wendy?
Yeah. The size of these two units we're talking about. Yaakov has 12 sons from several women. We don't hear of any other women or any other families among them, but he's got people who were with him, who are hired people or some ways connected. And this is a town, and he comes and moves in near the town, and so he's one family.
Right.
And the daughter, there's one daughter mentioned.
Right.
There may be some others we don't know because they didn't do anything. But Dinah goes into the town because she's lonesome for other girls.
Right.
To meet with the girls, and then she gets overtaken. And so that you've got what looks like two unequal sized groups, and they're requiring this whole town's men to get circumcised.
Right.
In order for them to find the non-existent women in Jacob's family.
Right. So you're asking a similar question to what Tova said earlier about the
size of it.
the realistic side to the story. First of all, how big is the town? You know, towns, we think of towns as big places, but there are small towns. In the Talmud, a town is, I believe, 100 people makes a town. So it's, those are good questions. I'm not sure the Torah wants us to ask that question. I think that wants us to accept the facts as they're given. And the idea is that Shimon and Levi have killed all the men whom they rendered defenseless through their offer, which was deceptive. The Mirma is, I think, the important point. But having done so, they, in fact, have at least symbolically possessed this town. Now, they're going to leave the town very soon as well, but symbolically, they have possessed the town. Let me just read a little bit more, and then we'll have much more to say about the story.
David?
Yes?
It just struck me as glaring that the Torah chose the word mirma and that they chose the word shleimim. And those two words were like, if the Torah highlighted things, that would be highlighted. The Torah uses the word mirma to describe them. And then it seemed the height of irony that Shem says, and they are shleimim with us, as if you miss the point, it's like hitting us over the head.
Right, I agree. It's an excellent point that it underscores the mirma, which is, I think from the Torah's perspective, a serious problem. Speaking b'mirma is, speaking untruthfully, which takes many forms, is for the Torah, it can mean telling a lie. It can mean blaming the other person for what I'm responsible for, which is the first story in the Torah. Why did you do this? The woman made me do it, that kind of thing, and not taking responsibility. The confessions, which always say, but, yes, I'm responsible, but, is always the but. Those kinds of statements. The kind of misleading statements. Lovin is the pro at that. Technically, you may say the truth, but it's actually a lie. There are many ways.
And is it possible that they really threw this out thinking that they would never do it and that they could just walk away from it?
That is a possibility. Right. That is certainly a possibility that they thought they wouldn't do it. That is certainly possible. You can't really tell. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, at least Yaakov thought they were going to. That's possible. But Yaakov may have thought that they're not going to do it. Maybe they thought they're not going to do it. Again, it's hard to know in the story. I think it's one of those stories where you actually can't tell, not because we're poor readers, but rather because the Torah doesn't want us to get a handle on it. The Torah wants us to leave it as a very gray story, a problematic story. And, I think there's more to be said about this. So let's just hold off for a while. We'll come back to it. I think these are all important points. That's a good point about Shlemim. I saw in the chat before, maybe it was Shmuel who said, wonders if the word shalem is related to circumcision. I think that's also a good point, because you have the word when
And
God.
Shalem was how he got there. It says Vayevo Shalem.
Yaakov comes to shalem, but I'm saying something else, which is what he said, which is that the word shalem, which means whole or full, in the chapter where God instructs Avram to become circumcised, the chapter begins with the Hitalech lefanai ve'yeh tamim, and be whole. And it's strange that you become whole through circumcision, right? In other words, the idea that the human being becomes full becomes whole, you aren't created this way, but you have to do something. And the thing you're doing actually is to impose a blemish upon your body. And the blemish upon your body, the blemish which would disqualify a sacrifice, would disqualify a priest from serving, in the context of chapter 17, is what makes you shalem. So the use of the word shlemim mitanu is maybe the Torah. I might think Chamor has this in mind, but the Torah is saying these people are shlemim, which is a reflection upon circumcision, which is you become a whole person sometimes by acknowledging your deficiencies, or even by in a certain sense becoming blemished. In becoming blemished, becoming human, actually, more human, and that's the human being shlemut, is become what a human being can fully be. So that's an interesting separate observation about the narrator talking to us. I'm not saying Chamor has this in mind, but the narrator may have it in mind.
Now that going forward with that, it just falls right in for me that's the significance of Yaakov's being wounded during his wrestling.
That's true.
And in fact, actually, I've never heard you before today advance the possibility that we're already at the fourth generation from the oracle with Yaakov's children. And it could be that actually a right reading is that through the Ma'aseh Shechem, they blew it. They could have been the fourth generation. But now the whole family, but now we see in what they did that the family is still Aramite. And it needs to be put through the Egyptian process, and then we'll get to another fourth generation.
Okay, that's a very interesting and a big topic. I've spoken about this actually multiple times, but you're raising, I think, a question that, in fact, I intended to raise, which has to do with if, in fact, this is the conquest of the land and it's so problematic, what does that say? I mean, that's really a very important question. But leave this for now. We'll get back to this. Sandra,
is it possible that this is an inflection point about what does it mean to possess the land? In other words, can you intermarry with the people of the land or not? And I think the narrator or the Chumash is basically saying, no, we cannot intermarry. Whereas Yaakov, married Rachel and Leah, and there is all sorts of times in Yehuda and so on so I think there's a point here that in order to be able to possess the land, you cannot intermarry. And Shoftim is full of times that when it's quiet, they intermarry, and then that's the sin.
Right. I think for sure I think the intermarriage is certainly problematic. I was focusing more, not so much on a particular family marrying the other, which I think the Torah views negatively. But the idea of becoming Am Echad is certainly out of the question. That is certainly out of the question. I'll leave your point for now. I wanted to come back to some of these points maybe next week if we get there, and just because the story has so many pieces to it that are interesting, and I think it is one of the truly foundational stories of the whole Bible, because it's a story that becomes revisited in a variety of contexts later on, and each of those stories picks up on a piece of it. I mean, one of the stories picks up on the whole thing, but there are other stories that pick up on a piece of the story and then sort of run with it. But I just want to see if we can finish the chapter now, and then we'll go back and I'll address a lot of these comments. In short, fine. So Shimon and Levi kill the town of Shechem, and they, verse number 26, they kill Hamor and they kill Shechem, and they take Dinah. In other words, till this point, we haven't thought of this. Dinah actually has been held, one might say, captive. Now, is it captive or is she willing to be there? We'll never know. But she's inside Shechem this whole time. The whole time the negotiations are taking place. It's not that Dinah walks out and stands with, you would expect, okay, this happened. Now Dinah goes home and now let's discuss marriage. No, Dinah is in Shechem the whole time. That's interesting. She's there either by free will or she's there because she can't leave. She's stuck there. So we don't know, can't tell. And now suddenly we have the other children of Yaakov. It's not just Shimon and Levi. Now in verse 27, B'nei Yaakov bo al hachalalim vayavozu la'ir asher tilu achotam. The sons of Yaakov came upon the corpses and they despoiled the city that had defiled their sister. Notice the city that had defiled their sister. Ha'ir asher tilu achotam. Earlier it spoke of Shechem, Timei, and the brothers, the other sons of Yaakov. Now it doesn't actually say the other sons of Yaakov. It says the sons of Yaakov. So the question is B'nai Yaakov in verse 27 mean the others apart from Shimon and Levi? Shimon and Levi kill Shechem and Hamor, take Dinah, and they kill the people in the town. And the other ones take the spoils. Is that the case? Or does it include Shimon and Levi as well? Can't tell. It says Jacob's sons. They're also Jacob's sons. So they take Vayavozu Eir, Asher Timu Achotam, and then in verse 28, Et Sonam v'et Bekaram v'et Chamorehem v'et Asher Ba'ir v'et Asher Basadeh Lakachu. They took the cattle, right? They took all that was in the city. And then in the next verse, in verse 29, v'et Kol Chelam v'et Kol Tapam v'et Nishehem Shavu Vayavozu v'et Kol Asher Babayit. And not only that, all their wealth, their children, their wives, they took them captive. It's exactly what Shechem had spoken to, and Hamor spoke to the people of Shechem. We can take their cattle, but they stopped at taking the cattle. They talked about taking their women as wives too, but not as booty. So over here we have, now whether this is the others apart from Shimon and Levi, or whether this includes Shimon and Levi is a good question. It says B'nai Yaakov, but here this behavior of despoiling the city that had defiled their sister, and their response seems to go way beyond anything that one would normally justify. And not only that, especially taking all the women. What does that even mean? We don't hear about these women and the children. We don't hear about them later in the Torah. And the word is interesting, the word Vayavozu La'ir. Vayavozu La'ir, right? Where's that verse? The previous, in verse 27, Vayavozu, there it is. Vayavozu La'ir. The word Vayavozu, of course, the word Vayivez is a word that appeared earlier in the Torah. It appeared in chapter 25. Vayivez Esav et habechorah. It's an Esav word. Esav Vayivez. Esav dismissed. Esav degraded the birthright, and that's a negative word. And it's actually interesting. We just read the Megillah a couple of days ago, and of course we know that Haman in the Megillah is from Amalek. He's an Esav character in the Megillah. It's some of Esav's qualities. When Haman decides to kill all the Jews, not just Mordechai, but all the Jews, what does the Megillah say about Haman? Vayivez b'yeinav l'shloach yad b'Mordechai levado. Vayivez b'yeinav, the Esav Yaakov. He's the piece of Esav that never forgives Yaakov. He's a Molech, he's a God. He's Vayivez. The Jews, on the other hand, Uba biza lo shochu et yadam. They didn't take the biza. They don't act in an Esav fashion. They act more like in a Jacob fashion, a non-Esav fashion. So here you have, once again, the choice of language is critical. It's not just that they took all kinds of things in a kind of Shem-like fashion, including the wives and the children, but the very use of the word vayovozu ha'ir. The biza, the choice of that word is a negative. So there is, I think, the Torah is condemning what they're doing. Now, it gives their justification. Asher timu achotam. But I would say, unlike the earlier story with Shimon and Levi, or the brothers speak b'mirma, because Asher timei et Dinah, that Shem had defiled their sister. And then you could say, okay, we understand their thought, we got it, okay, whatever. But over here, it strikes me that their behavior is so out of line that their justification rings hollow. They may have in their head, they may see themselves as justified, doing whatever they want. I think the Torah's position is that that's not the case. And now there's something else over here. So again, and now let's just read out a couple more verses, then we'll pause and take comments or questions. And now we have Yaakov's response and their response. Let me just say the following. Yaakov Shimon Levi. Yaakov does not address all of his sons. He addresses Shimon and Levi. And we can read that, I think, because they are two of the oldest sons, son number 2 and son number 3. By the way, from this, you see that Reuven was not involved in this. This is not Reuven's doing. It's the Shimon and Levi. Maybe not Yehuda's doing either. They may be included with all the other sons. He said to them, achartem oti. Now, the word achartem is an interesting word. They translate here, you have brought trouble on me. The story of Achab and Eliyahu Hanavi, when he greets him after he's caused the death of Navot, Kerem Navot, and he says, are you the Ocher Yisrael? That's what Achab says to, and Eliyahu says to him, not me, it's you. Ocher could be trouble, but trouble, I think, is not powerful enough. In modern Hebrew, an ocher is a traitor, betrayed. So Yaakov said to Shimon and Levi, maybe you have betrayed me. You have made me odious. You have made me odious among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And I am few in number. And that the other towns will come together and they will kill me. And me and my house, my family, he calls his house family a house, will be destroyed. That's Yaakov's critique of Shimon and Levi. Now, what many have pointed out is that he doesn't say to them, you did the wrong thing. He says, what are the non-Jews going to think? What are the nations going to say about me? They'll gather together and they'll kill me. So they see Yaakov's non-condemnation of the act here as less powerful than the response in verse 31, Vayomru, where here they translate, they answered, should our sister be treated like a prostitute? And that's the last verse in chapter 34. So the argument that some have made is that the fact that, number one, they get the last word. That's number one. And number two, not only did they get the last word, but their argument is a moral argument. You could disagree with it, but their argument is, we did morally the right thing. You're talking practicalities, that practically speaking, it could lead to trouble. They're going to gang up against us. They're going to attack us. We don't care. We got to do the right thing. We got to defend the honor of our sister. Right. And so therefore, the argument is that when you reach chapter 34, they get the last word and they make a moral claim as opposed to a pragmatic one. And therefore, this is part of Sternberg's argument that the Torah, therefore, has taken their side. I don't think that's right. I think it's an interesting observation. I've made it myself multiple times, but I don't think actually it's right. First of all, let me point out that later in the Torah, Yaakov does condemn the act. In chapter 49, he condemns it. Shimon and Levi are brothers. Their weapons are weapons of violence. Chapter 49. I don't want to be part of their council. I can't be part of their council. I'm going to divide them up. They're dangerous together. Because in their anger, they killed people. They uprooted the animals in their anger. Or rurapam, cursed is their anger. Yes, he didn't say they are cursed. He said cursed is their anger. But the context of it clearly condemns what they did. And they killed, in their anger they killed, clearly is referencing the story of Shem. So over here, he doesn't, in fact, condemn the act. And maybe he doesn't condemn the act for any number of reasons. Maybe he doesn't want to get into a whole dispute about right and wrong. He says, listen, practically speaking, you've put us all in danger, which is also wrong. It's not just practical. When you endanger a bunch of people, that's also problematic. Can't look just at the act in a narrow sense. You must look at the act in a broader sense. That's one point. But the other point is, verse number 31, Vayomru hachazonah yaseh achotenu. That translation, I think, is problematic. Because if the translation that JPS gives us were correct, I would have expected the Torah to say something different. I would have expected the Torah to say Vayomru lo, but they said to him, Hachazonah yaseh achotenu. Doesn't say that. It says, doesn't say they answered him. It says they said perhaps to each other. In other words, they're not responding to him. They're saying to themselves, what? Should he treat our sister like a prostitute? And it's not even clear, by the way, who the he is. Because the he is certainly Shechem, who just took her. But I wonder whether the he is not just Shechem. What they're saying to each other, I can't understand our father. His whole approach to this is off. He's treating her through his non-action, through his non-doing anything, through his words condemning us, treating our sister like a zonah. If that be the case, first of all, it's interesting that they're talking about Jacob, not to Jacob's face. So it's not, in a sense, yes, the Torah tells us what they're saying, but it's not a response to Yaakov. And we'll come back to this later on. And the last word is interesting, is achotenu. Now that's how the story begins, right? Achei Dinah, right? Shimon and Levi are called Achei Dinah. And now if we just look back at the story for a moment, just to recap what we have here, look back at the story. And we ask ourselves the question, and we'll continue with this next time as well. What is this story actually about? The story of Dinah. What lies at the heart of chapter 34 of Genesis? And to me, what lies at the heart of the story is the following: the relationship between Yaakov and Yaakov's children. That's what lies at the heart of the story. Because Yaakov, as he says, "V'nishmarati aniu beiti," me and my house, my family. Jacob's vow, Jacob's mission in life is to build a family. That is, to build a structure where everybody is in fact included. And over here, what's clear is that there's not just a dispute between Yaakov and Shimon and Levi on one hand, a tactical question, maybe a moral question. There's another problem here, which is it appears, and the Torah has emphasized, that from Shimon and Levi's standpoint, one can easily read it, that the reason our father is so passive here is because she is achotenu, that is to say, she is the daughter of our mother Leah. And this takes us back to the entire way the family has been built. That Shimon and Levi, right? And that Reuben doesn't act for whatever reason. Shimon and Levi, they're named Shimon and Levi because their mother said that God, Shama Hashem kisnua anochi, God had heard that I was hated and gave me this child Shimon. And with Levi, she said, perhaps this time my husband will join me. I bore for him 3 children. They're born to the mother who felt herself an unbeloved woman. right? The first child, she says, God has seen my onyi, my inui. So you're talking about a family that the way it's been constructed, without into blaming anybody, is constructed along the lines of the children of Rachel, the children of Leah. And what's striking is, and in chapter 34, Yaakov's ultimate utter passivity in this story, he's not going to do anything. One would wonder, for example, if the person involved was somebody like Joseph, what would Yaakov have done? Would he have said, what can I do? My house is being, or he would have acted very differently. Now, it is true, just we have to be honest about it, it's not his son, it's his daughter. And the fact of the matter is that's a patriarchal book, that is to say, the construction of the house. And Jacob has many daughters, by the way. It says his daughters and sons rose up to console him in chapter 37. But they're not mentioned. So to build a house means to build a covenantal family where everybody means every man in the house is included, maybe together with his wife. Okay, but so that's also a factor. But in short, we have the story over here, which at its core is about Yaakov and Yaakov's sons. And Yaakov's vow and Yaakov's aspiration to build the bayit. And this story points out the great difficulties he will encounter because of the internal conflicts within the family. That's the core of the story. Let me just conclude by mentioning a parallel story that I've mentioned on many occasions. It's also in my new book. And of course, it's the story of Amnon and Tamar, which is written clearly. The author of that story has the Chumash opened, because it's exactly modeled on the story of Dinah. And of course, since it's modeled on the story of Dinah, we can look at each character in the story. Maybe it pays to do that a bit next week. Look at each character and see how they appear in a different context. So, but the story of Amnon and Tamar is not about Amnon and Tamar. Nothing to do with Amnon and Tamar. The story of Amnon and Tamar is about David. And if you have to pick out one person, it's about David and his son Avshalom, Absalom and David. That's what the story of Amnon and Tamar is actually about. It's about David's doing nothing to protect his own daughter, whose name is Tamar, and Avshalom's killing of his older brother Amnon as revenge for the molesting of his sister Tamar. That's what the story is about at its core. It has all kinds of other interesting pieces. It's about kingship. It's about succession. It's about the difficulty of succession. It's about the person who might have been king, who will not be king, namely Avshalom, who in my view is the appropriate successor to David and the only appropriate one. But the point is, it takes the form of Amnon and Tamar. The story over here in chapter 34 is about Dinah, Shem and Dinah. But it's not about Shem or about Dinah, really. It's really about Yaakov. And it's Yaakov and Yaakov's Shimon and Levi. I would say there's what's the one of the laws of thermodynamics? Every underreaction, I would say the law in the Bible of human behavior. Every underreaction creates an opposite and sometimes unequal overreaction. And that's the story over here. One guy does nothing, that's Yaakov, and the others do too much, and that's Shimon and Levi. So that's what lies at the core of the story. Next week, I'd like to pick this up, and the Torah has blame to cast around everybody. The narrator is not beholden to any one person. That's just the wrong-headed thinking. The Torah has its own point of view, which is everybody's at fault. There is a problem, and in order to resolve the problem, everybody's got to self-correct, which is the larger problem of Yaakov's house. He wants to build this house, but he's his own worst enemy. In order to build it, everybody has to learn how to work with the other person. It's Yaakov and Yosef and the brothers, and this and how Rachel figures into it. It's very complicated, and that's the rest of Breshit. But this chapter really sets the stage for what follows in terms of the challenges in building the Bayit. Okay, so we have 5 minutes here. I'll take comments or questions now. Anybody wants to ask? Zella, yeah.
Wait a minute. Yes, it's interesting because verse 30
I counted 7 times where Yaakov is alluding to himself, me, my house, I, my men, my odious trouble on me, without a mention of Dinah. It's the brothers who actually bring her back into the story.
Right, right. That's a very good point. And actually you have this later on as well with Yaakov. When the story when the brothers come back from Egypt and they don't have, Shimon's not with them, and they find all this money, you know. So what? So they say we have to take Binyamin down to Mitzrayim to get Shimon back. And Yaakov says to the brothers, what not going down there? Yosef einenu v'Shimon einenu. Joseph is missing, Shimon is missing. And now you want to take this one? Alai hayu kulana. It's all on me. All these tragedies have befallen me. And that is, you know, a very human response, I think. And it's true from a certain perspective that from his perspective, he's the father of all these children. In other words, what's a tragedy for Jacob, Shimon missing is a tragedy for Jacob. Shimon is not the most favored, but he's still a son. Joseph obviously is a tragedy. Binyamin would be a tragedy. That's not necessarily true for the other people in the family. The loss of Joseph for the brothers is not a tragedy. It might involve a celebration. It might involve second thoughts, but I wouldn't call it a tragedy. They want to, okay, he's gone, father, end your period of mourning. He refuses to end it. He's going to mourn him forever. So I think that there is that sense with Yaakov in that story as well of a self-focus. And I think that's, he has to be able to step out of himself and to, which he will do later, I think, and to see the bigger picture. But it's a very good point. The brothers are the one that bring Dinah into the picture, as they call her Achotenu, our sister. Let me add one other point, just for food for thought, which is that you have a story here of brothers defending sisters, right? That's what the story is about. Shimon and Levi in particular, and all the other brothers less so, but also are speak up and you know, Asher Timei Dinah Achotam. And we're talking about a book in which we have already encountered 3 stories where a man says to his wife, say you're my sister. So the question that raises is, right? Say my sister that I'm not going to get hurt. And in all 3 of those stories, what they've actually done is put her in great jeopardy, right? They actually end up putting the sister in jeopardy because she's not connected to this man. He's only a brother, as it were, right? And she's in 2 of the 3 cases, she's snatched. In the 3rd case, she's almost taken. And the question is, I just put it out as a question. I have to think about this. Is there a relationship between the 3 sister stories we encountered earlier and this particular story, where she really is a sister, right? The big emphasis, she really is the sister. And the brothers defending their sister. That's an interesting question. The Avshalom story, of course, is the same. There he's defending his sister or avenging his sister. Anybody else for a comment or question here? Samuel, yes?
All right. The cantillation notes for the last pasuk are not a question. They're a declaration. It says, "Vayomru," stop. Our sister was treated like a prostitute.
Right. No, I agree with you, actually. And not every question is really a question. We know that, right? It's a kind of rhetorical question, I would say, which is the strongest. I would say that in general, in the Bible, when God asked the question, it's not a question. When God said to Adam, "Where are you?" I don't think it was actually, I mean, it can be read as a question, but I think it's probably better read not as a question. Like you would say in slang, "Where you at?" It doesn't mean "Where are you?" It means like, "Where is your brother Cain? Where's your brother Abel?" God knows where Abel is. God says his blood cries from the ground. So I think it's very interesting in general in a text and in non-text to think about when people present something as a question, is it really a question? And you're 100% right. Over here, it's not a question. It's a rhetorical question, which is 99% of the time a criticism. What? Is this the way? Can we allow our sister to be treated this way? Well, the answer is obviously not. That's there. Now, again, I think they're saying that to each other. I don't think they're saying that to Jacob. I think they're saying it about Jacob. He talks to them and then they say to themselves, not to him. I don't understand this guy. What is this? So I think that's an interesting question. In other words, if this is correct, then chapter 34 ends with the brothers talking negatively about their father. I mentioned this interesting because in chapter 37, it says that Joseph brought back evil report to his father, dibara, bad words to his father. What was he bringing back? Possibly this. You know, Father, what they're saying about you? Because here you actually have it. They're saying bad things about you. So that's possible that what Joseph does later, he's Jacob's spy. Not that Yaakov assigned him as such, but he reports back to Yaakov all of the stuff the other brothers are saying about Yaakov. And we know that by the time chapter 37 rolls around, that Reuben has slept with his father's concubine, that Shimon and Levi have, have a very bitter dispute with their father. Chapter 38 begins with Judah checking out. Joseph's gone, so the family is dissolving completely. And perhaps what Joseph is doing is reporting back this kind of speech to his father. But it is, yes, it is not really a question. Anybody else?
Rabbi? Yes,
Yes.
Rabbi, it's Sandra. Hi.
Yeah.
On the issue of Achotenu and Achoti and the story of my sister, our sister, Tikva Freimer-Kensky says, and she's emphatic about this, that this is the first time in the book of Genesis that brother saves sibling, as opposed to brother deceiving or trying to kill or splitting from or whatever sibling. So the fact that we have to pay close attention to when it says Achei Dinah and when it says Achotenu, and the fact that the entire story, which is about so much and it's so packed, ends with, in this way, I think Mayor Sternberg has, I think, a very good point. But Tikva Freimer-Kensky says, because this is the first time in Genesis that brother saves brother saves sister, and that we have to pay attention to the fact that Chumash ends this entire bloody and difficult and fraught chapter with, I mean, come on, it's all about our sister. And I think it is important just to keep in mind that this is a unique point in Genesis, where brother saves sister, as opposed to all the other behaviors of brother versus brother.
I don't disagree with that. I totally agree. I'm not suggesting that the Torah utterly condemns Shimon and Levi or the brothers. It doesn't. There's some very positive things, including the conquest of the land, including the concern for his sister. In fact, I made the point many times that when Yaakov sends Yosef to try to make peace with his brothers, he says to Yosef, aren't they in Shechem? Shechem is a city of brotherly love. Shechem is where siblings defend their siblings. He doesn't get to Shechem. By the time he gets to Shechem, they're gone. But it's clear. And Rashi points this out. They're in Shechem. Shechem is the place which demonstrates brotherly concern for his sibling. I don't disagree with that. I agree with that 1,000%. I'm saying something else. That Sternberg is wrong, and very wrong actually, because it is true that this is positive. But it's also true that there are 6 or 7 negatives, and they're big negatives. The defiling, covenantal, the lying, the picking on people who can fight back, the taking of the spoils. And I'll just add in conclusion that we discover in the next chapter, not only did they take spoils from Shechem, they took idolatry from Shechem too. That's a big no-no. So there is no way that any reader who sees the text, in my view, could possibly think that there's a validation of everything that Shimon and Levi do. My point is, it's all gray. My point is, yes, there's a very good piece to it. And there's also many negative pieces to it. And that's what makes it interesting. And that's why, in fact, it is picked up by so many other stories, because there's so many different pieces here to pick up. So we'll continue with this next week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Noah, what do you want to say?
So first of all, thank you again, Rabbi Silber, as always, for a wonderful class, and for everyone here for participating in our learning community. It really adds so much when you share your questions and thoughts. I did want to let people know that we do have another new class starting tonight. If you would like to double dip and have another dose of Drisha with Ms. Sarah Zager, she will be talking about how domestic labor is thought of in various stages of Jewish law and Jewish thought. I'm very excited about that. And of course, next week on Sunday, we have the annual Rappaport Memorial Lecture. If you are not yet signed up, you are highly encouraged to join us for that. And if you are, or if you aren't, in Rabbi Silber's Tuesday night class on the Siddur, I did want to let everyone know that we're going to be having a special guest this week and next, Dr. Nathaniel Berman, which I'm very much looking forward to, of course. And if you would like to join us for those two classes or for all of the remaining 3 sessions, then please sign up on our website. The link is in the chat. Be well, everyone.